The worst class doesn't get better. Tardy. It's not a word I'd heard very often, but I figured out what it means. Late. If you're tardy, you have to go to the office and get a piece of paper that lets you back into class. This year, I've heard the word tardy more often than I did all of last year. A few of my old friends were tardy from time to time, usually when the buses got in late. But Hurry Up Harry was tardy a lot. He got to school on time barely the first 2 days of the week, but on Wednesday, he was so late Mrs. Brisbane had counted him as absent. When he finally arrived, he gave his slip of paper to Miss Brisbane. "Very well, Harry, hurry up and get to your seat." "It wasn't my fault," he said. "Here's a note from my mom. She tells you there that the alarm didn't go off." He pulled a letter out of his backpack and handed it to her. She read it quickly, thanked him, and sent him to his seat. He didn't go right away. "We used to live almost next door to the school," he said. "Then I could walk, but now she has to drive me here, and it takes longer." Mrs. Brisbane looked at Harry as if she didn't know what to say, which is pretty unusual for Mrs. Brisbane. "Does this mean I can't have Humphrey this weekend?" Harry asked. "We'll talk about it later, Harry," Mrs. Brisbane said. "It wasn't really his fault, was it, Og?" I asked my neighbor while my friends worked on math problems. I should have been working on them too, but I was thinking more about Harry's problem than about number problems. Og didn't answer. He just splashed lazily in the water. I wasn't sure what he thought about Hurry Up Harry. That night when Aldo came, he went right to work, sweeping the room with long, graceful strokes of the broom. "We're still learning more about you guys in biology," he said. "Amphibians and mammals." "What did you learn, Aldo?" I squeaked. "Mammals are born from their mamas and amphibians hatch out of eggs," he said. I almost fell off my tree branch. "Eek!" he squeaked. "Og came out of an egg, like a chicken?" "Of course, after they hatch out of eggs, frogs are cute little tadpoles," Aldo continued. I wasn't sure what a tadpole was, but it was hard to picture Og being cute. Aldo chuckled. "Birds come out of eggs, and so do some reptiles," he said. "But of course, birds have feathers, and fish have scales and gills." Suddenly, my tummy felt a little funny. Gills and feathers, scales and eggs. I thought we were all just animals. "In the end, we're all a lot alike," Aldo said. He was finished sweeping and started straightening out the tables and chairs. "Are we?" I asked. My head was spinning. Og came out of an egg. He was cold-blooded, and he didn't have any ears that I could see. It seemed as if we had nothing in common. "That's the great thing about biology," Aldo said as he pulled a chair close to our table and took out his supper. "We're all living things." He took a great big deep breath. "And it's great to be alive, isn't it, Humphrey?" "Squeak," I answered. I couldn't argue with that. Aldo pushed a little piece of lettuce through the bars of my cage, but I wasn't particularly hungry. "And great to have friends of all species," Aldo added. Suddenly I remembered what Miss Mack had said when she first brought me to room 26. "You can learn a lot about yourself by taking care of another species." I guess that meant amphibians too. "It's great," I squeaked in agreement. Tardy again. That's what Harry was on Thursday. He got to school on time in the morning, but he came back from lunch after the bell had rung. He wasn't alone, though. Principal Morales brought him back. "I found Harry staring at the trophy case," he said. "He said he didn't notice all the other kids going back to class." "I told him he'd be late," Holly said. She forgot to raise her hand first, which made me miss my old friend Raise Your Hand Heidi Hopper. "Quiet, Holly," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Harry, can you explain why you didn't come back on time?" "Did you know Longfellow School won the all-district basketball championship 5 times, he said. "But they haven't won for 6 whole years." "No, Harry, I didn't," she said. "It's very interesting, but you promised me you'd get back to class on time after recess and lunch." "I know," said Harry, staring down at his feet. "Mr. Morales told Mrs. Brisbane he'd let her handle the problem. I thought Harry was lucky that he didn't have to sit in the principal's office and hear how disappointed Mr. Morales was. I was a little disappointed in Harry. Why couldn't he learn to hurry up?" "Harry, can you tell time?" Mrs. Brisbane asked Hurry Up Harry when she kept him in the afternoon during recess. Harry nodded. She asked him to tell her what time it was right then, and he was correct. "Have you had your hearing tested?" Mrs. Brisbane said. Harry nodded. "I can hear just fine." "Then why are all the other students able to hear the bell and get back to class on time and you aren't?" she asked. It was the same question I would have asked if I had had the chance. Just when the bell rang, I happened to be standing next to the trophy case. "I never noticed it before," he said. "I'll be on time tomorrow." It seems as if you have two problems, Mrs. Brisbane said. One problem is that your parents have a little trouble getting you here on time. I know, Harry said. They lose track of time. Mrs. Brisbane nodded. Yes, but you have a problem remembering to get in line and come back to class on time. You can't blame your parents for that. I guess I lose track of time too, Harry said. I have an idea, Mrs. Brisbane said. Why don't you watch the clock in the morning and remind your parents when it's time to leave? It may not be your fault that you're late, but maybe you could try to help them. Okay, Harry said. Second, when you see your friends lining up, you line up too. No matter how interesting the trophy case is or what size anthill you see, you need to take responsibility. I agree with that. You won't have Humphrey this weekend, but if you can get back to class on time all of next week, you can take him home, she said. Really? Harry smiled from ear to ear. I can do that. Mrs. Brisbane let him go out to recess, but after he left, she kept on talking. I'm not sure if she was talking to me or just to herself, but I listened. I'm pretty sure Og did too. I've had problems with dawdlers before, she said, but never quite like Harry. The next day, I waited anxiously for Mrs. Brisbane to make a very important announcement. Luckily, I didn't have to wait long. Paul Fletcher will be taking Humphrey home for the weekend, she said. I have the permission slip. Who's picking you up, she asked. My dad, Paul said. I was happy to be going home with small Paul. He seemed happy too. In fact, he looked a little taller for the rest of the afternoon as he sat up very straight and glanced over at my cage a lot. It won't be long now, Humphrey, he told me after recess. Not everybody was happy, though. Harry looked embarrassed because he hadn't been on time all week as he'd promised. Tall Paul seemed especially grumpy. I know helpful Holly was hoping to have me for the weekend too, but in the end, I thought Mrs. Brisbane made a very good choice. Small Paul's dad wore a suit when he picked me up. He had taken off from work early to get us. I have to admit I felt unspeakably important, but I did remember to say goodbye to Og as Mr. Fletcher carried my cage out of the classroom. I'll tell you all about it on Monday. Bye, I said. At their home, Mr. Fletcher got me settled on a desk in Paul's room. Humphrey, I've been looking forward to meeting you for a long time, he said. Thanks a lot, I replied, which made Paul and his dad laugh, even though I'm pretty sure they didn't understand exactly what I'd said. My weekend at Small Paul's house was pretty quiet except for his little brother Max. Every time he saw me, Max jumped up and down, flapped his arms, and squealed. I think that meant he liked me. He was only 2 years old and much smaller than Paul. Sometimes Paul picked his brother up and carried him around. To Max, Small Paul was extremely tall. The Fletcher family did fun things like watch movies and play games and eat popcorn, like the other families I'd stayed with. Paul, of course, did his homework because he was a very, very, very good student. On Sunday afternoon, Paul cleaned my cage while Max watched. Poopy, Max said, flapping his arms up and down and squealing. I was glad Paul didn't squeal. Afterward, Paul settled down at his desk and worked on his model planes. They had small wings and a small cockpit and were just my size. I wondered how it would feel to fly, but then I remembered the unsqueakably dangerous boat ride I took once and tried not to think about it anymore. There were dozens and dozens of tiny parts to be glued together, and the amazing thing was, Paul knew just where to put them. While he worked, he talked to me. Luckily, I'm a very good listener. Just my bad luck, Humphrey, having another Paul in class, he said as he carefully glued the wing in place. He sighed a very large sigh. He would have had to be tall. He can't help that, I squeaked, trying to be helpful. Have you noticed? He's always showing off how tall he is. Paul carefully held the wing in place while he tried to glue. I was puzzled. Paul G. had never shown off as far as I could see. I don't think he's a show-off, I said. He's a big bragger, Paul muttered. Oh, if just once a human could understand my squeaks, especially when I'm trying to be helpful. The worst day of my life was when he came to our school. Paul let go of the wing, and it stayed in place. Small Paul was extremely smart, but that didn't mean that he was always right. Someday I'm going to design, build, and fly my own planes, Humphrey, he said, looking down at his model with pride. Look at this. A Hornet. Mach 2. I guess you don't know what that is. But someday maybe I'll take you for a ride. Thanks, I squeaked. I think. That night I had one of those weird dreams. This time I was flying in one of Paul's little wooden planes. I was zooming high into the sky when suddenly a giant hand reached out and grabbed the plane. I looked up at the face of the person holding the plane in his hand. It was Paul Green, Tall Paul. Now you know what it feels like to be tall, he said. Then he raised his arms and let the plane go up, up, up into the clouds. I kept going and going until, thank goodness, I woke up. Like I said, it was a weird dream. On Monday morning, Max gave a final squeal, and I was on my own way back to room 26. Small Paul, as usual, got to class early. Kelsey was right behind us, and she bumped Paul's arm, which jiggled and joggled my cage like crazy. Be careful, Kelsey, Paul snapped at her. Sorry, she said. Is Humphrey okay? Yes, I squeaked weakly. Kelsey seemed like a nice girl, but I wish she could pay a little more attention. How was your weekend with Humphrey? Mrs. Brisbane asked when Paul placed my cage back on the table by the window. Great, Small Paul said. Maybe you can show Paul G how to take care of Humphrey now that you have the experience, she suggested. Paul looked shocked. Do I have to? Well, it would be nice, Mrs. Brisbane said. He's new to the school and he'd like to be included. I'll think about it, Small Paul answered. I could see by the look on his face that he'd already made up his mind. Just then the final bell rang. Hurry Up Harry raced through the door while it was still clanging. He rushed to his seat and sat down, panting but looking proud. I'm not tardy, am I? He asked. No, Mrs. Brisbane said. He looked pleased, but when I glanced at Small Paul, he wasn't looking pleased at all. I squeaked to my neighbor. We really have our work cut out for us. Boing, he agreed. Humphrey's rule of school, never, never, never be tardy, and always, always, always listen to the classroom pet, even if you have trouble understanding.